spent his entire life fighting for the family that took him in. Then, with his dying breath, he discovered the truth. Everything he had achieved had been stolen from him. Even his legendary 7 wings, a power never seen before, were used against him. Given a second chance, he abandons the family that betrayed him and disappears before history can repeat itself. This time, he isn't fighting for loyalty, he's coming back to take back everything that was stolen. On a dark winter night, the Duke of Elmheim stood in the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by his dead comrades and enemies. His wounded son, Ash, approached him and asked why he was there. He had entrusted him with command of the Eastern expedition. He replied that he was here to strike him down. From the very beginning, he had intended to use his squad as bait and then leave them to die. He understood everything correctly, right? The Duke said that this was the only use for the wingless. Wasn't he right? Ash A of Elmheim, son of the Duke of Elmheim. It was the greatest warrior house on the continent, offering its swords as protectors of the royal family. The head of the house, Roderick A of Elmheim, was the only one in this country with 7 wings. On a whim, when Ash was dying in a blizzard as an infant, he saved him. That's why he did everything he could to repay him for this. But it so happened that he didn't have wings to prove his worth to his father, and so everyone mocked him. The crest of the wing. The more wings, the greater the magical power a person hides. As the only son of the Duke who couldn't use magic, his brothers called him wingless. And yet, he simply continued to swing his sword with unwavering devotion, believing that one day his perseverance would be rewarded. And so, that night, his father rewarded him in full. His squad was lured into an ambush. He told his father that he followed him and trusted him. And this is his answer? The Duke smirked and said, "He is just a tool." What did he expect? If his role is played out, then it is time for him to disappear. Ash was furious. He lashed out at him with his sword and realized that he was a fool for believing him. He struck, but only managed to slightly wound his neck, and then his brothers threw chains on him and cut off his arms and legs so that he could no longer move. One of them mockingly asked, did he still not understand anything? In the end, he will remain wingless, which he had been all this time. Crawling on the ground, that was his destiny. MC furiously asked his father, if he was still going to throw him away like that, then why did he pick him up? Roderick squatted next to him and told him not to flatter himself. He did not need him from the very beginning, and then lifted his head by the hair and added, he only needed the power of 7 wings that resided in this body. Ash did not understand what he was talking about. After all, he was wingless from birth. Roderick threw him a disdainful look and said that his mother was truly useful because she gave birth to such a brat for him. After that, he left. MC extended his hand to him and excitedly asked him to wait. What was he even talking about? Let him tell him everything. At that moment, his brothers pierced his body with swords and left. After a while, he felt cold and began to slowly lose consciousness. He thought, is this really where he will die? If everything ends like this, then what has he lived for all this time? He saw snow swirling in the sky. Everything around was white and warmth was emanating from somewhere nearby. At first, he thought it was the afterlife, but quickly realized that this was reality. But where is he now? He tried to move his arms and legs and thought, is this tiny body his? It is just like a baby's. And then he realized that he is a baby. He turned his gaze to the woman who was hugging him. She had already died, and apparently recently. And then he heard the knight's voice from afar, saying, continue the search. They must find this woman at all costs. In such a blizzard, she could not have gone far. For the sake of Duke Roderick, they must return the baby she took. He was surprised and thought, what just happened? Did they say something about Duke Roderick? Does he want to take the child, so they are looking for him? He heard that he was also picked up on a similar snowy night. Is it possible that he returned to the past? But this is such nonsense. He heard the clatter of hooves. They were already close, and he decided to think about it later. If he stayed here, he would definitely fall into the hands of the Duke. He got out of the embrace of his dead mother, crawled in the opposite direction from the squad of knights, deciding to get away from here as much as possible. His small arms barely pulled the rest of his body along with them, which made them burn. It was very difficult for him to breathe. His whole body and limbs were burning. His whole life was one continuous crawl. But this time, he would definitely survive. He remembered his father and swore revenge on him. Time passed, morning came, but he no longer had the strength to crawl, and he fell asleep long ago. A little girl approached him and called her father, Viscount Highfried. He picked up the baby, wondering where he had come from, then noticed a trail in the snow that stretched all the way from the top of the mountain, and he was amazed that the baby had covered such a distance on his own. He looked at the boy in shock and wondered who this child was. When MC woke up, he heard the noise of voices and a child in front of him. At first, he thought it was an angel coming for him, but the child simply punched him in the face, and he immediately opened his eyes to see a bunch of children bending over him. Kudo told her older sister, Marfa, that the baby had just woken up, and she asked them not to make fun of him, otherwise his cute nose would fall off. These restless children started pulling him in all directions, and Marfa barely took him away from them, and MC was shocked by all of this. He had no idea what was happening here, so he decided to just run away. He jumped out of Marfa's arms, crawled with all his might to the exit, and the whole crowd of children ran after him. He was in a panic, so he sped up and accidentally did something that made him fly and break through the roof of the estate. He didn't understand what was happening at all. Somehow he flew so high. He quickly realized that it was magical power, but he couldn't control it, and that's why he fell down. When he already thought he was going to crash, the Viscount caught him in his arms and said, "Just think, this time a child fell from the sky. He really is strange." Looking at him, MC was very surprised, because this man is the older brother of Duke Roderick. It turns out he ended up in another house of the Elmheim family. Hyfried F. Elmheim is the current head of the Viscount house, a branch of Elmheim. He was once known as one of the two wings standing next to his brother Roderick. He is the man entrusted with the protection of the royal family. But the Viscount Hyfried he knew was supposed to die in that civil war, after which his house fell. Now he is absolutely sure that he has returned to the past. But to think, trying to escape from the Duke's house, he ended up in the house of his older brother. While he was thinking about all this, the Viscount carried him to his wife. She took him in her arms and asked, "Did this child fly because his magical power got out of control?" Her husband answered her, "It seems so." He knew that he was an unusual baby. The woman looked at MC with a smile and kissed him, asking, was he scared? But now everything is fine. He was surprised because he had not known the tenderness of a mother since childhood. Looking at the two of them, the Viscount smiled, then extended his hand to the boy and said, "This child hides enormous power within himself. His mark is proof of that." He lifted his clothes, and then he saw his back in the mirror. There were as many as 7 wings on it. Now he understood what his father meant when he said that he only needed the power of the 7 wings that resided in his body. He picked him up only in order to steal his 7 wings. That's why he became wingless. After he himself tore out his wings, how dare he say all these vile things? The woman looked at her husband and asked what they will do with this child. MC became nervous. His fate was being decided right now. He can't let his power fall into the hands of Elmheim. He needs this power to take revenge on him. And then the Viscount declared that he will accept him as his adopted son, which MC was very surprised. He stroked his head and said that this child is still a chick who is not yet able to fly on his own. Until he decides to fly of his own free will, he will take responsibility for looking after him. Suddenly, there was a crash. The doors opened and the girls collapsed on the floor, and their father asked if they were eavesdropping. They embarrassedly answered him that they were just worried about the child. After which Kudo went to her mother and asked what the name of this boy was. She thought for a few seconds, then picked him up and said, "His name is Aster. This is the name of a new star born in their house." 10 years later, the day of the debut came. Viscount Hyfried and his son and daughter arrived at the festival venue. Hyfried was the first to get out of the carriage, followed by MC. He gallantly offered his hand to his sister Alphen, and she got out of the carriage, thanking him. After adjusting her hair, she followed her father along with her brother. The Sword Dance Festival is an annual event held by a certain ducal house under the patronage of Elmheim. It is a social gathering for the families of military nobles. Although these events are designed to strengthen bonds between nobles, during the festival, each house presents aspiring swordsmen to showcase their talents. They walk through the crowd, everyone whispering about the Viscount and his adopted son of unknown origin, and how they are thus dragging the name of Elmheim through the mud. They were most interested in Aster. Alphen heard their whispers perfectly well, and angrily told her brother to ignore them. If he showed weakness, they would trample him into the dirt. He noticed how she clenched her fist in nerves, and his father said, "This is the current state of the Viscount's house." He wanted to show him that. Is he disappointed? MC answered him with a smirk that this was not true at all. This kind of coldness was exactly what he liked. Hyfried laughed, pleased with his answer, and he thought, in his past life, as a disgrace to the Elmheim house, he made the worst possible social debut here, so this place is full of bitter memories for him. But now that his 7 wings are with him, everything will change. He noticed his siblings looking at him with displeasure from one of the windows of the estate. This gave him the determination to make the most spectacular debut in high society. The first fights soon began. In an era when knights ruled the world, they were expected to possess both strength and grace. Strength was demonstrated through swordsmanship, and grace in their glory. The symbol that embodied both was the supreme sign, the wing crest. The fight was over, and Alphen said it was as impressive as ever. No wonder Furin and Flair hadn't wanted to come. Aster's expression darkened, recalling his humiliating defeat in this very arena, and his sister, noticing this, called out to him and asked if he was nervous. After all, this was his first sword dance festival. He told her with a smile that he wasn't particularly nervous, and added silently, "Rather, it made him nostalgic." She looked at him puzzled, trying to figure out what he was thinking, and their father said that he had to go to the meeting and would leave Alphen in his care. She was indignant. She was a year older than Aster, and he said with a smile that it was because she was a little absent-minded. His father patted him on the shoulder and said that there were a lot of children his age here. He should use this chance to expand his circle of acquaintances. He added in a whisper, "Be careful. No one can find out about his 7 wings. After that, he left. Alphen puffed out her cheeks in offense, and MC thought, easier said than done. Immediately after he left, he felt many glances at him and scratched the back of his head in confusion. It was difficult to communicate when the atmosphere was so openly hostile. He caught sight of an acquaintance. He immediately headed towards him, and his sister asked where he was going, to which he replied that he needed to make friends. His brothers were sitting on the couch surrounded by their dogs. He approached Dallas and asked with a smirk, "Who the hell is he?" He greeted him confidently and introduced himself, saying, "His name is Aster F. Elmheim. He is his younger cousin." He saw him and decided to say hello. His brother laughed and told Dallas that this is the adopted child, the one who was taken in by the Viscount's family. Dallas grinned and said, now he understands why he has the nerve to use the F in his name. Dallas and Gurion, both legitimate heirs of the Elmheim house and the ones who killed him in his past life. Just think, he used to be deathly afraid of them, but now he realized they are children playing at being adults. Alphen pulled him out of his thoughts. She grabbed his hand and offered him to go back. He had already said hello. Dallas called out to her and asked, did she also come? Was she really going to hide behind her father's back today? Why doesn't she come and entertain them? This is the order of the main house. She turned to him and firmly said, there is no master-servant relationship between the main and side branches. She pulled Aster along with her, and he asked her to wait, as he was not finished yet. But she squeezed his wrists so tightly that he decided not to bother again. But Dallas finished too. He mockingly and loudly asked his friends, did they know that their father could not even protect the king, despite being a knight? He had to let his own brother cut off his hand to bear responsibility. He was just glad that the blood of a loser did not flow in his veins. Alphen could not stand this anymore. She let go of her brother and approached Dallas, furiously ordering him to take back his words. She would not allow her father to be insulted. Instead of answering, he spat wine in her face and said, her father must be so disappointed that he only has useless daughters who cannot even inherit the title. This isn't a dance hall for her. Next time let her wear some rags so she doesn't have to worry about getting wet. She lowered her head and cried, and MC thought he was worried before he came here. Worried that seeing their faces again would leave him completely angered. But he was glad that they were still the same trash. He snatched a bottle from a boy's hand, gently touched his sister's shoulder, asking her to move away, and then threw the bottle at Dallas, and when he deftly caught it, he immediately swung his sword, cutting it in two. The wine immediately spilled on Dallas's head. He wiped the blade, tasted a drop, and asked mockingly, is it just grape juice? Just right for such a spoiled aristocrat, right? 3 years ago, Aster trained with his father to use the power of 7 wings. He couldn't contain the magic, and it spilled on a powerful stream. Hyfried told him to restrain himself. Was he really going to kill his sisters? His burst of magic knocked Kudo unconscious. Her older sister held her in her arms, tearfully begging her to wake up, while the other girls watched in fear from the sidelines. Hyfried wondered if these were the 7 wings. To think they were hiding such a dangerous power. Could he and his son really be able to control it? At that moment, a subordinate of one of the lords burst into the assembly hall, exclaiming excitedly, something bad had happened. He wondered what was so important that he was barging into the meeting, and the answer was, the main and collateral branches of the Elmheim family, the sons of both families, were dueling. Roderick and Hyfried frowned, and then immediately headed there. Hyfried's daughter ran up to him and started telling him everything, and the man looked at the arena and with a smirk told the others to look. This is a quarrel between brothers from the noble Elmheim family. You don't see something like this every day. Everyone gathered to watch it, and he said, depending on the outcome, this sword dance festival promises to be hot. Meanwhile, Dallas showed everyone his crest on his hand and called Aster an idiot for picking on them, members of the Duke's family. After all, he's just a mongrel born in the wilderness. He really doesn't understand the difference in their strength. Everyone admired his crest. He enjoyed the attention and told Aster to show his wing crest too. Or is he ashamed to show it in public after seeing it? MC said he was right. Such a shameful sight. Boasting about some pattern, as if it was something to be proud of. He would never do that. Dallas shuddered with anger, and Aster said that if he lost, he would apologize to his sister. And Dallas agreed. But if he won, then he would be his dog. He would chase him to death for the rest of his days. After these words, he rushed to attack. MC blocked his blow, but the recoil pushed him back and his hand trembled. Dallas grinned and said that this is the power of those who have wings, and then began to strike again. Alphen was deeply worried about her brother, and the man said, young Dallas's swordsmanship is still crude. But no matter how clumsy he is, his magical power makes up for it. This is the advantage of those with the wing crest. If the magic of one wing is like candlelight, then the magical power hidden in 4 wings is truly the light of an entire explosion. Dallas pounced on Aster and asked where all his passion had gone. Didn't he want to make him apologize? Or was it just talk? He pounced on him, telling him to show what he could do, and one of the lords said that the outcome of this fight was a foregone conclusion. Dallas swung his sword, but MC blocked his blow, which he was very surprised at, and said that he was talking too much. He threw it away and prepared for another blow. He spent these 10 years in the Viscount's house, learning to control magic, waiting only for the chance to take revenge on them all. He delivered a powerful blow, which Dallas barely held back. He fell to one knee, and his brother was shocked that this adopted child made him do this. Aster pressed his swords harder. He smiled nervously, not believing it. He is the owner of the four-winged crest. MC looked down at him from top to bottom. Under his onslaught, Dallas' swords cracked and people asked in surprise, is he really going to win like this? Dallas was completely suppressed. To think there was still someone like him left in Elmheim. Aster involuntarily released his magic, causing his father to immediately become worried, and he continued to press Dallas. He remembered how he had cut off his arm with that nasty grin on his face. The magic flared even more intensely with rage, and Dallas, in a panic, asked him to stop. Alphen called out loudly to her brother, telling him not to do this, which caused him to regain his composure, and a bright flash erupted. Broken blades flew apart, and the man looked thoughtfully at the winner of this duel. A puddle formed under Dallas, and MC said, next time, to avoid the fear of getting wet, let him come wrapped in old rags. Alphen let out a sigh of relief, and Aster looked at her and his father with a smile, thinking he was no longer the wingless ash. This realization alone dispelled the clouds in his mind. Enough for today. Suddenly, he felt a terrifying pressure, and it emanated from Duke Roderick, who was obviously dissatisfied with the outcome of the duel. He immediately turned to him, and saw how sternly he was looking at him. Meeting his former father made him uneasy. Everyone present began to whisper. No one could believe that the youngest child of the Viscount's family had actually crushed the heir of the main house. But now everything was even worse. After his pride was trampled like this, he would not remain silent. The 8th head of the main house of Elmheim descended into the arena. His son immediately smiled, thinking that his beloved daddy had come to his aid. The Duke's shadow covered Aster from head to toe, and he measured him with a glance. But he still remained confident. Dallas immediately ran up to his father and pointed his finger at Aster, saying, it's him, this idiot who went against the main branch, although he's just an adopted child. Let him use his power to crush him. Roderick gave him a displeased look, then pierced his palm with a sword, which he clearly didn't expect from his father. He screamed loudly in pain. Gurion was horrified by this sight, and Roderick asked, how dare he smirk? He trampled their family name into the dirt. Someone who can't even stand up for himself has no right to hold a sword. Realizing what he was about to do, Hyfried told him to stop, but he didn't listen and raised his sword over his son. But nothing happened. MC stood between them and the Duke's sword lay on his shoulder. He asked with displeasure in his voice what he was doing, to which he replied, his cousin hasn't apologized to his sister yet, so can he postpone the punishment for later? Roderick said he heard Hyfried had taken him in as an orphan. Did that make him a true Elmheim? He told him he was a Viscount's son and suggested he set aside blood ties. What about knightly pride and the burden of inheritance? His father had taught him that well. Roderick glanced at his brother and then said, then, as a member of the Viscount's family, he needlessly wounded the main branch. The king's sword, the pinnacle of 12,000 knights under their banners, that pride. This was no longer just a childish squabble. He should understand that his father had paid with his hand for his disloyalty. Hyfried drew his sword just in case, and his brother held the blade to his son's neck and asked how he would pay. Despite his threat, Aster was undeterred and said, this was not a brotherly squabble, but a formal duel. He responded to the insults against the Viscount's family with his sword. He himself said that anyone who can't stand up for themselves has no right to hold a sword. Therefore, he won't give him a single finger. The man whistled, and Count Maze asked with a smile, he's 10 years old and he behaves like this? He must be joking. Roderick looked him over, put his sword away, and said that he understood everything, then let him stand. MC immediately did so. We suspect unkindly, immediately after which the Duke struck him, sending him flying against the wall at high speed, causing a loud crash. Alphen covered her mouth in fear and began to cry, and Hyfried was simply furious. He immediately attacked his brother, struck him, which he blocked, and then ran to his son, worriedly asking if he was okay. His blade broke, but he himself continued to stand in his stance, despite the wounds he received. Roderick glanced at the boy and left with his son. Only then did Aster allow himself to relax. He almost fell, but his father caught him, and he said with a smile, he protected him. Hyfried admitted that he was magnificent. Meanwhile, Roderick went up to the 2nd floor, and the man said that it was childish. But letting the boy talk would mean ruining the reputation of the main branch. Well, wasn't that a worthy compromise? He stood up to the Duke and survived. He's a rising star. This is the best debut for this guy. The Lord added that he was terrified. He thought Roderick would cut him in half right there. Roderick sternly said that an era of upheaval would come, a storm strong enough to split the world in 2 or 3. A new day dawned. MC was practicing fencing with a knight of his house, and the others watched in amazement. He knocked the sword out of his opponent's hands, causing him to fall. After that, he looked at Aster with a smile and said that it was impressive, then stood up, and his comrades began to discuss this fight. He has quite serious skills. It's scary to think that he's only 10 years old. After returning from the sword dance festival, he trains with even greater zeal. This must have inspired him a lot, and he crushed the Duke's 3rd son. They had to endure insults from the main family for a long time, so this is great news. After listening to them, MC rushed into battle again and thought, at the sword dance festival, he fully demonstrated his power and presence. This should silence those who called the Viscount's family a stain on Elmheim. But his main goal is still the main family. He was too greedy and wanted to see how far his skills would go. He wanted to test himself even more back then, but in his current state, he can't defeat Roderick. In the end, the crest is just an indicator of the rank of hidden mana. Even innate mana is a useless treasure if you can't control it. And yet, he still can't draw out the power of the 7 wings. If only he could experience the power of the 7 wings to his heart's content without worrying about going mad. He struck, winning the duel once again, and signaled for the next knight to enter the arena. His sister approached him and asked, is he showing off his skills again? He, as usual, knows no limits. By the way, their father is calling him. He decided to go to him immediately and noticed that Alphen was dressed differently today and said, this outfit is rare. Didn't she say she didn't want to wear this because it looks unsightly? She told him that balance is important in everything. Looking at him, she realized that she, too, couldn't remain the same. She pointed her sword at him and said with a smirk, so when he returns, he will keep her company for a while. He laughed and asked her to go easy on him, after which he went to his father's office. When he entered, Highfried told him to sit down. Apparently a serious conversation was brewing. It had been 10 years since they accepted him into their family. To be honest, he thought about waiting until he grew up a little more, but he decided not to. He placed a ring with a shining ruby on the table and said, this is proof of the status of the next head of the house. He wants him to inherit the title of head of their house. As he knows, their family is in a delicate situation. However, they are still a side branch bearing the name Elmheim. As a lord governing a territory, he has much to protect. They cannot leave the heir's seat empty forever. Astor frowned and asked, did his sisters agree with this? He answered him that his sisters would return from the Knight Academy in 3 days. He intended to officially talk to everyone then. He was talking about his older sisters Marfa and Kudo. He smiled and said that if that was the case, neither of them would be happy about it. Kudo in particular would definitely be furious. She hated him, simply because he was born a man, and it just so happened that he was blessed with 7 wings. He can't accept this ring, he can't even control his own mana. He's an inexperienced fool who almost killed his own sister, so he doesn't have the loyalty to convince them. His father wasn't upset. On the contrary, he smiled and said, he's long doubted that he's really a child. He planned to give him this ring as a reward for the sword dance festival, but it seems something will please him more. He placed the box on the table, and when he saw its contents, his eyes widened in surprise. Inside the box was the demonic sword Graham. It can control the power of the 7 wings, and that's why it's called the magic devouring sword. After that, they went to the forest near the estate, and MC asked if he just wanted to show him the sword. Wouldn't the training hall be more suitable? He replied that it was just a precaution, since it often smashes the house to pieces. This is the demonic sword Graham, a famous blade that is inherited from generation to generation only by the eldest son of the Elmheim house. He ordered it to be brought for him from the storage of the main house. He pulled the cloth from the blade and saw that the sword was broken. His father said, as he sees, this sword has no blade. However, if you pour magical power into it, a blade appears. He demonstrated it to him. This is a sword of possibilities, which gains completeness thanks to the magical power of the owner. He added more magic. The blade flared brightly, and a stream of energy rushed forward, destroying everything in its path. And he said, however, with weak magical power, there is a danger that the sword will absorb all the mana. Moreover, this weapon has a complicated history. He handed the sword to his son and asked if he wanted to try it. He took it decisively, tried to pour his magical power into it, and magic immediately flared in all directions. He had no control over it. The magical power flowed into the sword itself, and it produced the corresponding result. A bright beam of light shot into the sky, visible for only a second. The knight who saw it asked in shock, what was that light? Did a comet fall, or something? His friend told him not to talk nonsense. Something simply flew into the sky. While they argued, Alphen sighed heavily, and there was no need to guess. She knew for sure that it was her brother's work. Astor, meanwhile, chuckled nervously and said that this sword was simply monstrous. And his father looked up at the sky and remarked, what was truly monstrous was its power. The bearer of the 7-winged crest had never been born even once in the entire history of the Elmheim generations. If he mastered this power, he would eventually become a swordsman far superior to those with 6 wings, like himself or Roderick. MC vowed to surpass the Duke, and his father warned him, excessive power inevitably sparks conflict. If word got out that he had 7 wings, everyone would be desperately jealous of him. Some would want to exploit him, others would try to eliminate him as a hindrance. Therefore, to avoid regretting his own powerlessness when the time came, let him become strong. He needed to do it while he still could. He extended his hand to help him up, and Astor thought he was right. He would no longer drag out a miserable existence, like in his past life. He thanked his father for his instructions. He would definitely master the 7 wings and this sword. 3 days passed, and Marfa and Kudo finally returned. Kudo immediately stood at attention, greeting their parents. She thought about something for a second, then extended her arms to her sweet sisters, and told them to hug their beloved Kudo in honor of the reunion. but they chose Marfa instead. Kudo turned to them in shock. It turns out they didn't want to hug her because she would have immediately ruffled their hair. She didn't want to admit it and said that it hadn't happened. She, who had perfectly mastered chivalry, would not have done anything so unworthy. She saw that Alphen was still standing aside and immediately rushed to hug her, asking, "She was a good girl, wasn't she?" She hugged her so tightly, and she started to break free, and Marfa asked, "Where is Aster?" Her parents told her about it, but Kudo's face immediately changed in expression. MC was training with his new sword at this time, but nothing worked, no matter how hard he tried. Even if he can create a sword from magical power, he can only contain it. He looked at the stone that his father had recently broken and wondered what he should do to be like him. His sister approached him and noticed that he was bragging about his strength again. He was surprised that she had already returned, and she said, "He didn't even come to greet his older sister. Isn't that too cold of him? Or maybe, since he is special, they don't even come into his sight?" She had heard about the sword dance festival. Even at the Night Academy, everyone was talking about it. Their father must be very proud of him. Aster said that she had also become famous. He heard that she had already participated in many missions and had managed to distinguish herself, despite being just a trainee. She became the only knight to receive the Honorary Knight Medal this year. She told him that if she couldn't do at least that, she wouldn't have been able to become her father's successor. She also heard that he had given up on talk of legacy. Was he so determined to take care of her? Realizing that he had told her everything, MC thought, "Why create so much trouble?" He replied to his sister that he had no such intention. He simply thought that he was not yet qualified for this. Kudo sighed heavily, then walked up to the tree and took out a sword, saying, "Her father and her brother are so evil, and they know perfectly well about her dream." He became nervous, and then she swung the sword at the tree trunk, cut it down, and threw it at her brother. Fortunately, he managed to jump aside in time. Landing, he indignantly exclaimed, "What is she doing?" She told him to come here. She will check him for the first time in a long time. Next, she will hit him for real. He excitedly asked her to wait, because this sword is not yet completed, and she asked if he could come up with the same excuse in front of the enemy on the battlefield. He smiled nervously. She was not his enemy, and she took a stance, saying, "A knight's mindset is to always be on the battlefield. If he holds back too much, she might even crush him." After that, she jumped, and he thought, she must be joking. When he barely manages to control his magical power, she decides to attack him. But he has to do it. If he does not give it his all, she will definitely kill him. He put his magic into the sword. She pounced on him with a smile on her face, and their swords crossed. Each blow thundered throughout the forest, and she said that his swordsmanship is more refined than ever. To think that he is able to keep up with her abilities, even after she honed her skills at the Night Academy. However, he only has a pitiful excuse for a sword. His control over magic is completely lacking. She struck him with a blow, sending him flying, but he managed to land on his feet and exclaimed in response that she was still as ruthless as ever. She had been like this since childhood. Was it because he was the only man in the Viscount's house with the right of inheritance? Or because he was special and possessed a wing crest that surpassed anyone else in the family? She was like a living storm, challenging him to a duel at any provocation and calling the world unfair. In short, she was his natural enemy. He was distracted by these thoughts, and his sister immediately pounced on him and said, as she thought, he was unfit to be the next head of this house. Marfa, meanwhile, was watching their fight from the window and asked her father if it had really been wise to leave them alone. At this rate, this quarrel could lead to casualties. He replied that they were good opponents in their own way. They might be a little reckless, but it would not come to this. She hoped so, then asked why he called them back from the academy. It wasn't just to discuss the succession, was it? He confirmed it and showed her a letter from the Elmheim main house. It seemed that the elder leading the main house base wanted to see his grandson's face. Marfa worriedly noted that this was certainly a serious turn of events, and he agreed with her. In the worst case, they could lose Aster. At that time, he parried his sister's attack and told her not to talk nonsense. He had already refused to discuss the succession. She had heard that too. She exclaimed in response, their father said that his refusal in itself was unacceptable to him, and then struck again. MC felt a weight, as if he were fighting a troll swinging a giant hammer. He deflected the sword to the side, causing his sister to fly forward. He wanted to ask her to stop, but she interrupted him and asked with a smile, "He just tried to escape, didn't he?" After that, she delivered another powerful blow. Bright sparks flew in all directions, and Aster was thrown back and hit a tree trunk. After that, she said, "A third-rate warrior can only swing a sword, and a second-rate one wields magic. By mastering both a sword and magic, one can become first-rate." She is disappointed in him. The difference in the wing crests means the difference in the amount of mana a person can control. They say that the difference of just one wing is approximately a threefold gap in strength. In other words, in terms of magical power and endurance, she, with 5 wings, should be 2 full stages weaker than him. And yet he avoided a direct clash of forces and escaped to his favorite sword swing. Does he really distrust his own strength that much? Or is he perhaps afraid of falling into madness again? like he did 3 years ago? MC was even surprised. He never thought about it. Had he unconsciously limited his own strength? Maybe the reason this blade seemed unstable was because he was trying to forcibly suppress his magic. Kudo wrapped the sword in aura again and said that it had everything she could ever desire. If he was so arrogant as to let it rot without even realizing how lucky he was, then let him give it all to her. She lunged at him again, and this time Astor decided not to hold back and parried her blow with full force, which surprised her. He smiled and thanked her for opening his eyes, then lunged at her without even materializing. This confused her. At first she thought he had run out of mana, but she quickly realized that was not the case. Magic, invisible and inexhaustible, hidden within the 7 wings, had gathered at the tip of his sword. MC knew he couldn't master it right now, but he needed to do it for just a moment. Forget about maintaining his form and concentrate all his magic at the moment of impact. He delivered a powerful blow. His sister managed to parry it, and she exclaimed with a smirk, so at least he had thought of something, even though he was a fool. He told her that he had no intention of wasting this second life he had managed to grasp. Not this power, not this sword, and certainly not his family. Because this was something he hadn't been able to achieve before, no matter how hard he tried. Kudo was surprised, confused by the words about his second life, and then he rushed into the attack. A second before he would have struck, he suddenly disappeared somewhere, causing her to fall into confusion. And then he appeared next to her and said, "No more handouts." Immediately after that, he struck, and after that, Kudo no longer remembered anything. She woke up in her room, and Marfa noticed. She finally woke up, but she was in no hurry. Kudo immediately jumped out of bed and excitedly asked what happened with the duel, what happened with her fight against Astor. She told her that he himself brought her here. He said that she fell asleep right in the middle of the duel. Perhaps the fatigue from the journey got to her. At least that's what he said. Kudo frowned and said that it definitely couldn't be, and then remembered. At the last moment, she was sure that Astor had cut her, but in fact, he must have dispelled the mana blade a split second before the impact. What she felt was only a residual trace of mana passing through her body. Astor would never kill his own sister, but at that moment, she truly believed that he would kill her. Even though he is much smaller than her, he really is a mean little brother. This thought made her smile, grabbed her sword, and asked her sister where Astor was. She would never accept this outcome of the duel. This time, she would give it her all from the start. Marfa said he was no longer here. He had received a summons from the main house. He had left only recently with his father. She didn't know about this. Kudo was, to put it mildly, shocked by this news. Meanwhile, MC and his father were already halfway to the main house. Highfried warned him. The people they would meet were the elders who upheld the truth of House Elmheim. They were the former heads of the main and branch houses, as well as influential figures in the entire house. Although they had retired, they still wielded enormous power, which is why they were called the Silent Rulers. These elders hadn't shown the slightest interest in him since the day he adopted him. So why had they summoned him now? Astor assumed it was because of what happened at the Sword Dance Festival. He'd heard that the elders valued the family's prestige more than gold or even their own lives. Those who tarnished that prestige were thrown into a cage to be fed to the beasts. His father asked where he'd heard such stories, and he evasively replied that he'd simply heard them somewhere. But he was already prepared for punishment, or at least exile. His father asked if he was sure that was okay. After all, he'd left without even saying goodbye. He smiled and told him that everything was fine. He'd been planning to leave anyway, as soon as the sisters arrived. Besides, Kudo was probably glad he wouldn't be getting under her feet. She could relax. Thanks to her, he'd finally begun mastering the new sword. He felt like he could draw out more of the winged family's power than ever before. So, whatever happened to him next, he shouldn't even try to help him. He was prepared to survive on his own. His father wanted to say something, and suddenly Kudo's voice was heard from outside the carriage, exclaiming indignantly, "What do you mean, on your own? He's the youngest in the family, so he shouldn't act like someone incomprehensible." They both looked out the window and were very surprised to see Kudo. She must have run all the way to catch up with them. She kicked open the carriage door, climbed inside, and said that he was so cruel to her, he left without saying a word to her. She heard everything. He was called to the main house, right? Even she and Marfa had never been called there. He said, he is sure she understands, but he can't take her with them to the main house. She sat down next to her brother and answered him that she knows it. He called them here to look after everything while he is gone, right? She understands that perfectly well. But this call means that he is in a situation that requires extreme caution. Even Marfa said that he might not come back again. To calm her down, he said with a smile that she was exaggerating. He was going there just to talk, and thought, although whether he would be able to return after this, that was the question. She seriously told him to listen to her carefully. She can't stand him. He is her younger brother. He has 7 wings. He is always treated specially. He is stronger than her, even though she is his older sister. And he acts like an adult, although he is the youngest. She can't stand all this. But still, he is part of her precious family. No matter how strong he is and how mature he acts, he is still her younger brother. So let him definitely come back so that they can fight again. She will not let him get away with such a victory. After that, she jumped out of the carriage, and MC looked after her, asking why she came all this way. Highfried smiled and said that she was a good opponent, and his son mentally thanked his sister. He will definitely return. When they arrived at the main house, they were immediately met by guards, and their leader said that the Great Elder was already waiting for them inside. Highfried declined the escort, as he knew the way himself, but the guard refused him. He was strictly ordered to escort them both inside personally. The atmosphere was tense, as Astor thought. They didn't call him to babysit their grandson, but still, it brought back memories. He hadn't been home in a long time. As they walked, his father said, "He's sure he understands this already, but today, especially, he can't lose his composure, no matter what they say to him." He answered him that it depends on how they behave, and his father clarified, that's exactly why he says the problem is with them. He started telling him about the elders, but MC wasn't listening at all. He glanced at the training grounds, seeing Gurion, but his brother Dallas was nowhere to be found, and he thought, with his working arm shattered, it would be difficult to return to duty so soon. His father called out to him and asked if he was listening. He turned to him and excitedly confirmed it, and after they surrendered their weapons, a guard led them to the entrance, and Astor calmed down, promising him silence. In the end, his sister warned him to return safe and sound. They entered the meeting hall. The chief elder remarked that they had finally appeared, and it had been more than 10 years. His great-grandson, Highfried, knelt in greeting, and MC thought, so this is the monster lurking in the shadows of Elmheim? The sixth head of the family, Zanus Elmheim, and the rest are most likely simply under the wing of the house. There are a few familiar faces from the sword dance festival, but Roderick is nowhere to be seen. The elder understood what he was thinking, and said he wasn't there. He was the leader of the knights, reporting directly to the royal family, so he didn't have time to be distracted by such trivialities. So they, the old soldiers, were doing him a favor by taking on administrative matters. Astor thought he'd never even seen him in his past life, so he didn't care. But he'd gathered so many dignitaries without the current head present. For someone who had resigned, he still seemed to wield considerable influence. Highfried asked what exactly he meant by trivialities, and his grandfather smirked. Hasn't he already figured it out? He'd heard his pet had caused quite a stir at the sword dance festival. MC had known this would come up, and Highfried responded to the elder's words. As for this matter, the current head of Roderick should have handled it personally by now. Others immediately objected. It was nothing more than a public performance. It doesn't change the fact that the Elmheim name was tarnished. Taking in a child of unknown origin as an adopted son was a mistake from the start. They would have turned a blind eye if he had remained harmless, but he bared his fangs at the main family, and everything changed. They have no choice but to exile him. And, of course, he will not escape the appropriate punishment. Astor couldn't bear to hear all these people attacking his father and exclaimed that it was all his doing. His father had nothing to do with it. Highfried shook his head, indicating that he should remain silent, and Zenas said, it seems he still lacks discipline, since he is trying to intrude into the adults' conversation. Under their banner are 12,000 knights. They bear the burden of the Elmheim name. However, knights are not a monolith. There are countless others who watch from the shadows, waiting for a chance to seize the upper hand. Naturally, this also applies to those in this room. They simply want peace of mind. They need proof that he will not harm their home. He handed him the sword and asked, does he remember this? When he failed to protect his master and trampled the name of Elmheim into the dirt, right here in this room, he allowed Roderick to chop off his hand. This time, let him prove his loyalty by cutting off this boy's head. If he does this, the matter will be closed. MC was scared, but his father immediately refused. He would rather take his own life than raise a sword against his own child. Astor looked at him in shock, and the elder said, in that case, he can die. His wife, his daughters, and this boy, every last one will be executed, and from today on, the Viscount's house ceases to exist. The guards pounced on them from all sides. MC was angry and asked the elder what he was so afraid of. A group of grown men huddled together and trembled, looking pitiful. If they were so afraid of being bitten by their own dog, then they could banish him or kill him as they pleased. But they could not touch his family. He began to take off his clothes and mentally asked his father for forgiveness. He would have to disobey him. When he took off his shirt, everyone saw the crest on his back and were very surprised. No one had ever seen anything like it before. He said, if they touch his family, these 7 wings will become enemies of Elmheim. They better think twice. Amidst the surprised voices, the elder approached the boy, and the nobles asked, the crest couldn't be fake, right? After all these hundreds of years, for something like this to appear on a human body? The great elder asked. Did he even understand what he was showing them now? Astor confirmed this with a confident grin. He had heard that the more wings, the more surprised people were. Count Maze laughed and clapped his hands, and when everyone glanced at him, he apologized. Zenas said that the crest was an organ that produced magical energy, bestowed upon people by spirits in ancient times. By passing this power from parent to child, from generation to generation, people honed its power even more. And yet, No one has ever reached the level of the 7 wings, with the sole exception of the Spirit Clan, which was the progenitor of the crests themselves. MC asked if he was implying that he was a member of this Spirit Clan. He replied that if his 7 wings were real, then it was possible. Right now, the fate of the entire family depended on him, and he said that he was the son of a viscount. And right now, he didn't care at all about the circumstances of his birth. All he wanted to know right now was whether they were willing to see him as an enemy or not. Even if he were banished from Elmheim, there would be many noble houses who would fight to accept the owner of 7 wings. And for them, who were already afraid of rebellion, this would be a huge threat. They should be willing to keep him close, the symbol of the 7 wings, the one who surpasses even the Grand Duke Roderick. At the mention of his name, they immediately tensed, and he thought, just like the old man said, even Elmheim is not united. The fact is, a rebellion is coming, a massive civil war that will engulf the entire country. He had already seen this future once. So that he and the Viscount's house can survive what is coming, he wants to determine right here who is his friend and who is his enemy, even if it means risking a little. Zinnis chuckled and asked, did he really believe he was worth that much? There was no proof that those 7 wings were real. He challenged him back. If he didn't believe him, he could safely kill him. But if they tried, it would mean war between him and all of them. And he thought, well, if Elmheim got serious, killing someone like him wouldn't be difficult for them. So what would they do? Would they take the bait? Count Maze clapped his hands and stood up, saying that their conversation was going in circles. How about giving him a test right here? The Lord was indignant and asked, doesn't he also want to see the power of the 7 wings? After this, it wouldn't be too late to decide his fate. So what does the elder say? After all, they were in the estate of the world's greatest martial clan. He was sure there would be a couple of suitable tests here. Astor looked at him with a smile. He had no doubt that this man was an ally. Zinnis agreed with him and told the boy to follow him. After all, it was a grandfather's duty to punish a grandson who couldn't keep his mouth shut. They walked into another hall where there was a huge cage, and Zinnis said, beyond this darkness is an underground bunker connected to the drains. It used to serve as an evacuation shelter in case of emergency, but now he keeps a magical beast there. The essence of the test is simple. Defeat this beast. That's all. Heifried looked at his son and called him a problem boy. And this, after he told him so many times to keep the existence of the 7 wings a secret. He told him he couldn't hide something so obvious forever. This was a good opportunity. His father asked him to remain vigilant, and he grabbed the chain and jumped into the drain. As he descended, he noticed the Count's gaze on him. Once down, he noticed that it was indeed dark, but not so dark that he couldn't see anything. When his eyes adjusted to the darkness and he looked around, he saw something terrible and cried out loudly, "What is that?" Dallas's head lay on the floor, fear etched forever on his face. Zinnis said he'd given him a chance to regain his honor, but all he did was moan until the very end. It was unbearable to watch. He too had better not disappoint him. A chomping and crunching sound was heard nearby. A huge lion was devouring the remains of Dallas, and Astor drew his sword. The beast roared loudly upon noticing him, and the test began. He thought, so the rumors about Elmheim keeping magical beasts in their estate were true. Only this time he felt sorry for Dallas, for being born in a house full of monsters. The lion pounced on him, and he lunged forward and swung his sword several times, cutting the monster into pieces. Everyone was amazed at his abilities, and he said that his sister was much scarier. He already thought it was over, but it was not that simple. The monster's body fused together, and he, looking at the tentacles crawling out from under the beast's skin, thought that this could not be. Is this monster undead? Realizing this, Heifried became very worried about his son and indignantly exclaimed, "Why is such a monster living in the basement of the estate?" Zanies stroked his beard with a smile and said that the thing was attracted to the smell of death. He believed the beast had decided there was enough carrion here, so it crawled into the basement. Since it wouldn't die no matter how much they cut and burned it, he ordered it captured, deciding that it would be the perfect opponent to test someone's strength. And thanks to this, they no longer have problems disposing of the bodies. The man said that capturing the undead is no easy task, even for an experienced knight. And yet, he ordered the boy to kill it. Was he simply going to watch a child with 7 wings die? He told him that if that happened, it would mean he was nothing more than a boaster. The crest of a wing without power is worth less than a common decoration. The man objected, and he told him not to worry. Even if he died, they would be able to deal with the consequences. In fact, they might even be more comfortable that way. He chuckled softly, and Count Maze glanced worriedly at the boy, wondering why he'd been so overbearing. He shouldn't die so easily. MC, meanwhile, continued to hack at the monster, but no matter how many blows he landed, he felt no recoil at all. Besides, the monster's regeneration was simply phenomenal compared to ordinary undead. But the undead were already dead, so to finish them off completely, he'd either need to burn them with sunlight or purify them with a holy weapon. And if he couldn't do either, then don't engage. That was standard protocol and common sense when facing the undead. But of course, he had no escape route. If he only used superficial, ordinary methods, then his possession of 7 wings was meaningless. He would prove his worth. He'd show them he could crush ordinary undead with brute force. He swung his sword, cutting off the monster's limbs, and its body was thrown back and hit the wall with a crash. The entire building shook, and everyone was amazed at the power of the 7 wings and tried to see what was below. Had he really defeated it? The dust obscured everything. Zanies looked closely and saw the boy, then said in disappointment, "What a pity." The monster pounced on Aster, grabbed him, and threw him to the floor, growling menacingly. Highfried immediately fell against the bars, worriedly shouting his son's name. The Count warned him not to do anything so tactless as try to save him, and he asked in response, was he telling him to just stand there and watch him die? Maze smiled and asked him to calm down, to let him take a closer look at him. It seemed he still had an ace up his sleeve. MC grinned at this, delighted at the success of his plan. The monster's body had become noticeably thinner from the numerous blows. He gathered his strength in his blade again and pierced the monster, causing blood to pour from its mouth along with a sophisticated roar. He resolved to continue this until it died, pouring even more strength into it, and his magic surged forward, piercing the monster's body. Highfried was surprised. He'd seen this before, he'd taught him, but this was something entirely different. A stream of magic swirled like a tornado. The chains tore loose, and the ceiling cracked. The bars of the cage snapped. Everyone panicked and urged the elder to leave, but Zanus stood and watched the power of the 7 wings. The Lord fell to the ground in fright and asked, "Is everything quiet? But what exactly happened? Where did the magical beast go?" Zenas looked at it in surprise and realized he had caught the relentless undead in a whirlwind of magical power and crushed it to dust. It was a display of brute force, pure quality and quantity, primal magic that couldn't even be called technique. Could this really be the work of the 7 wings? Zenas asked. Had he done something like this before? Highfried replied that it was unlikely. He couldn't help but be amazed at how his son was growing. Maze spoke. "Well, Great Elder, did he pass the tests?" He paused and replied that he doubted anyone here would object. Maze shouted, "Aster, did you hear that? He passed the test, so he suggests they come up here quickly." Aster replied that the chains they lowered earlier had gotten tangled in all this chaos. Perhaps someone could throw him a rope? Sometime later, Zenas sat in his office and asked the protagonist if he was sure about this. If he missed this chance, he wouldn't get a second one. Aster replied yes. He wasn't interested in fighting for the inheritance of the main branch of the family. Besides, if someone like him were hanging around his cousin's estate, they wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully. His place was still in that old man's house. Zenas asked again, "He calls this modesty?" He couldn't uncover the ambition burning in his eyes. He intended to turn against their family sooner or later, didn't he? Aster froze and looked at him questioningly, prompting Zenas to ask, "He wants Roderick's head? He shouldn't be so cautious." He had no intention of interrogating his motives right now. He asked again, "But why? Aren't the rebels their enemies?" He replied that he had already said they weren't one. This Roderick was too stubborn, and if his existence served as a deterrent, then so be it. But if he bares his teeth at him even once more, then he understands what will happen, right? The protagonist thought, what a monster this old man is. At that moment, Highfried approached him and asked what he had told him. Aster replied that he wanted to accept him into the main family, but he refused. Highfried asked again, what did that mean? But before he could process it, Maze stepped forward and said he was sorry. He would be treated much better if he were officially under the guardianship of the main family. Aster replied he was Count Maze, if he remembered correctly. Why had he offered to help him then? He replied that he had no idea what he was talking about. He just wanted to make fun of the impudent boy. But more importantly, from today on, he had truly become the master of the 7 wings, both in word and deed. Let him see it. Opposite him, there were many people who reasoned, these are the 7 wings, he must obtain this power. No, he needed to get rid of him before he became a hindrance. After all, he's still a child, and there's a way to use him. As he himself said, the wing crest, known as the 7 wings, carries enormous weight in itself. From now on, the number of those targeting him will only grow. Aster asked if that meant he was one of them, Count Maze. He tensed up, then said that, in fact, he was the headmaster of a night academy, and finding promising young men was part of his job. That old man over there was the same, so he was looking forward to his enrollment at their school. See you later. After this conversation, he left, waving at Aster, and he thought that this guy was a slippery character. It was too early to decide whether he was his friend or not. At that moment, Highfried approached him, put a hand on his shoulder and said that he would have to tell him about his triumph in detail. So, should they go home now? Aster confidently answered yes. Mom would faint when she saw these wounds. After some time, the knight knelt and reported, "Knight commanders, young Lord Dallas died during a test arranged by Lord Zenas the other day." At that moment, Roderick answered, "I see." He had heard that Highfried's child had also been summoned from the main family. How had it gone with him? The knight wondered if he felt as if he'd ignored everything concerning his son, and said he had good news. He replied that everything was clear, meaning the 7 wings had truly awakened within him. He asked again, so he knew about this? At this rate, the balance of power within the family, which had been maintained for so long, could collapse. They should take action. Roderick said to leave things as they were. If it could be shaken by an obstacle of this magnitude, Elheim would have fallen long ago. Besides, there was no rush. The 7 wings would sooner or later belong to him. For now, let him play free. He would be pleased to see how long the infant he allowed to escape that day could struggle. This is the child of 7 wings. 4 years later, a university employee started shouting, "Applicants for the entrance exams to the Night Academy, please come to the registration desk. Those who have completed the exams should proceed quickly." Some of the knights turned around and asked, "Is this the guy from the rumors? That can't be right." He heard he was a much sterner guy. The man placed documents on the table and said that the state knights are responsible for any injuries or accidents during the exam. If he agrees, let him sign right here. After that, please let him present his wing crest. They can't let anyone without magical power through. It's impossible to forge. When the man took the document in his hand, he said, "Okay. Now his wing crest is Aster Elheim." When he heard the name, he became frightened and looked in surprise at the protagonist, who asked, should he have presented his wing crest? But his duty lies in a place that's not so easy to show. Isn't his face enough to get him accepted here? Sometime later, when people had gathered in the square, Aster was among them, and suddenly heard someone calling his name. The guy said he was actually talking to him, the one standing there with such an air of importance. He'd never seen his face before, and didn't know what kind of village nobleman he was, but didn't he think he'd come to the wrong door? The guy's name was Bigger Smythe, and he said Elta, one of the elite knights, was gathering here. This was the venue for the selection exam for candidates for the glorious royal knighthood. Did he understand? Aster replied that there was no problem then, and Bigger started yelling at him to stop. Everyone here had gone through grueling, torturous training, and even so, they returned to take this exam again and again, dreaming of the path. And he had come here waving that childish sword? A pathetic messenger like him had no place here. If he'd just come to gawk, then he should get out of here right now. The surrounding guys realized that Bigger had started up again, hazing the newcomers again. And doesn't he get tired of doing this every year? But more importantly, isn't the guy he's pestering the same Elheim everyone's been gossiping about? That's Aster, the one with the 7 wings. At that moment, Bigger was lost in thought and surprise, when suddenly another guy approached them and asked, "Wow, who is this? Could it really be his cousin Aster?" Aster realized it was Gurion and looked confidently into his eyes. Gurion bowed and said they hadn't seen each other in a while, smiling. He'd heard that no one even knew when or where he was born, so he took the liberty of calling him his cousin. Aster replied that he was sorry about Dalice, and Gurion replied, no, he shouldn't worry about it. Such a worthless creature deserved to die. On the contrary, he felt relieved now that he was gone. Just because he was a year older, he always acted like he was something incomprehensible. He was also in his way. He doesn't know anything about these 7 wings of theirs or anything, but he better not underestimate those of them who belong to the main branch family, okay? With that, he turned around and finished saying that because now there was no one left here to protect him. The guys around him were discussing, were these 2 from the Elheim family at once? This time the candidates were out of luck. The main and branch families are still squabbling, right? They don't want to be caught in the crossfire. At that moment, Bigger realized his mistake, and his expression changed. Then he turned to Aster and asked, "Wait, is he by any chance from Elheim?" Aster smiled and told him to just call him Aster. After that, he offered him his hand. Sometime later, at the site of the first exam, the guys gathered and were told, "Gentlemen, he is glad you could come. First, he would like to express his gratitude for your bravery and patriotism. These royal knights differ from local knights in that they exist in the wilderness. They serve the king, protect him, and are honorable swords who risk their lives for the king. They don't need dull and useless swords. Even if they consider today's test a battlefield, they must demonstrate their true worth with their full strength." Aster was among these men, thinking that what he was saying was complete nonsense, but he finally returned here. The path to becoming a royal knight, when he was wingless, he wasn't even allowed to stand here. Beyond this line lies a world of the powerful he could never reach, and the man who still reigns at its pinnacle is the commander-in-chief of the royal knights, Roderick Elheim. Let him just wait there, Roderick. He'll reach at this very moment. To do so, he must first break through this selection exam. At that moment, the boy raised his hand and shouted, "Let them begin this immediately." This would be the first test, and at that very moment, sharp arrows rained down on them, destroying one of the men standing directly behind Aster. He turned around in fear, and the host shouted that the first exam was a turret test. Let the winner be the one who remains standing until the very end. A moment later, arrows flew from all directions at the men who were trying to escape, unsure what to do with it. They were afraid and screaming. Blood was everywhere, and the guys were shouting to run, because if they stayed there, they would simply be killed. They needed to form a group, cover each other's backs, and deflect all the arrows. The leader, watching from the sidelines, replied that, as expected, those with experience from previous attempts would know what to do. But even so, the survival rate was only about 30%. Such superficial measures would soon reach their limit. What they wanted to see was that incredible power that only the bearer of the wing crest could achieve. Aster simply stood silently, not bothering anyone, and Bigger started shouting, Why is this idiot just standing there? Was he frozen in fear? Aster continued to stand there, motionless, and Gurion considered dying like that, transformed into a hedgehog. At that moment, Aster drew his sword and raising it high, cut through the arrows flying his way. All the guys were stunned by what they saw and realized he deflected all the arrows with a single swing. Aster smiled and told them to aim at him with all their might. A moment later, he continued casting his spell with a calm expression, seemingly effortlessly defending his opponents with his own powers. Bigger wondered what kind of monster he was. Not a single arrow was reaching him. The host was surprised. Does he manipulate the released mana to create an upward flow? What incredible mana control. It was as if he were caught in a storm. A moment later, a strong wind arose, and the people didn't know what to do. They asked if it was over. Was this really the end? The host said more had survived than he'd expected. So what? It was excellent endurance, gentlemen. Let them look at the corpses around them. Those still standing had passed the first trials. There was no time to rest, so he would lead them to the next trial. Let them follow him. Bigger began to ward off fear and muttered, "What an instructor from the underworld," after they'd endured a hail of arrows. Aster asked, "What, old man? Are you exhausted already?" Bigger asked again. Why did he look so completely unperturbed? The moderator noticed he showed no sign of fatigue after expending so much mana. Aster possessed 7 wings. They'd see how he fought next. A moment later, Gurion followed everyone, recalling his words from earlier. He understood Gurion, that he must prevent him from becoming a royal knight at all costs for the sake of the future of Elheim. The moderator announced that to ensure fairness in the next test, everyone would use identical swords. Everyone must hand in their swords and receive new ones before the training session. Bigger asked, "Why is that necessary? What a hassle." Aster asked again, "Was it different before?" Bigger replied that the swords they carried and those of mid-ranked knights were almost identical anyway. "It's just a guess, but they were probably wary because of that strange sword of his." Aster looked thoughtfully at his sword, and Gurion said what was to be expected from his cousin. It seemed he'd already tamed a hanger-on. Bigger asked again, "Who was it he called a hanger-on?" Gurion continued, "If he remembered correctly, he was the heir to the house of Baron Smythe, correct? A third-rate village noble like him would learn a painful lesson if he fawned over anyone." When Gurion passed him, Bigger trembled, telling him to wait a second. "Young Master Gurion," he said. As far as he could see, he had absolutely nothing to do with this guy. Aster laughed at what was happening, realizing the atmosphere was tense. At that moment, the host shouted, "Gentlemen, I will now explain the rules of the second trial. The second challenge is a siege battle. They've been divided into 3 teams, and they'll fight for control of each other's camps in the forest. A camp is considered captured when their team's flag is raised on the flagpoles. The team that holds 2 or more camps by the time the evening bell rings wins. Any actions that render the flags unusable, such as damaging or confiscating them, are prohibited. But there are no other restrictions. They should consider the permission given to them to hack and kill their enemies." Now he announces the teams they'll be participating in the challenge with. Guys exchanged glances, and a moment later, they were assigned to different teams. Aster said, "The house alarm has risen, and this is a sign that the challenge has begun. Each camp has 3 flanks. To win, they need to capture at least 2 camps, including their own." Bigger asked, "But doesn't that mean that only one of the 3 teams will be able to advance? That's how it works, right?" Aster replied, "That's right. Is something bothering him?" The ordinary guys reasoned, "This means they'll have to fight Elheim, right? And that's somehow rather strange." Aster, when he heard this talk, looked around questioningly, and Bigger asked, "Don't they get it?" They were simply terrified of Elheim's possible revenge. When he started shouting about it, Aster was dumbfounded, and Bigger said that the enemy was the young master, the head of the Elheim family, and even if this was a test, just imagine what it would be like to raise a sword against him. They would probably never again be able to proudly call themselves knights. In the worst case, all the servants could be killed, and that was quite possible, and no one wanted to call themselves an enemy in the face of this family. Aster asked, "Then they refused the test?" Bigger replied that next time would be better than throwing away the rest of their lives right here. He probably wouldn't understand that. He was referring to their feelings, the weaklings. Aster replied, "Just think, he was isolated during a team fight. But that makes sense. He'd already forgotten, but for knights, Elheim is just that, a family of tyrants who cannot be resisted." And Gurion, the symbol of this reign of terror, recalled Bigger's words and realized that from the outside, he too was ultimately just one of them. And yet, it was somehow too quiet. Had no one yet joined the fight? Were they simply being cautious? Or was there something else going on? At that moment, a young man came out to meet him and asked who would have thought he'd actually come here alone. He assumed this meant everything was going exactly as he'd predicted up until that moment. Aster, confused by who they were talking about, asked why he'd taken down his own camp's flag. The man said that, just in time, he also had some free time. When he tossed the cloth into the air, he announced that he would be his opponent. Aster was dumbfounded, not understanding what this all meant. Gurion decided to show him, cousin, how true members of the Elheim family fought. At that moment, he was simply walking in the distance with his subordinates. The second stage of the Royal Knight selection exam is a siege battle. 20 participants are divided into 3 teams. and the team that captures 2 or more territories by the end of the exam wins. In other words, unloading your team's flag on the enemy base is an absolute requirement for passing the exam. That's why he wanted to ask, wasn't he on the yellow team, so why was he raising the red flag? The guy replied that everyone had simply formed an alliance. Elheim and he, the eldest son of the Nolan family, renowned as the founders of court art, has something of a holding. Christopher Nolan, his crest is 5 wings. During the first exam, he found himself in the shadow of the 7 wings, and didn't really stand out. However, only 2 people passed that tower test without even a single bruise. These 2 were Aster, the owner of 7 wings, and Nolan. They are brilliant, uncut diamonds among knights. It's a shame they can't both pass. At that moment, their battle began, and Aster asked, is he really talking about the alliance? Does he even understand that even if that's the case, only one team can win? Nolan replied, that's why he decided to let the main family win. By this point, his partner and Elheim were likely already on their way to his base. Things were bad, since Bigger and the others were in danger. Aster asked, he knows what happens to those who go against Elheim, right? Did Gurion threaten him with something similar? Nolan replied, knowing they'd be crushed, no one would deliberately get in the way of the carriage. Knightly nobility is built on a strict hierarchy. It's simply the natural behavior expected of an aristocrat. With these words, he struck Aster with his sword, causing his own to crumble into pieces. Aster realized something was wrong with the sword. Had the examiner slipped him a defective piece? Nolan said he could rest assured that it would be a fair one-on-one duel. He'd never liked the Elheim family, especially upstarts like him. At that moment, he struck Aster's sword, which crumbled into pieces. When Aster realized he was left without a weapon, he stabbed Nolan with the remaining blade and began to run. Nolan screamed, "What, he's running away?" Aster shouted that he'd deal with him later, but first, he'd found someone he needed to settle the score with. Nolan asked if he'd really scared him that much. He was a true disgrace to all knights. At that moment, he looked at the sword fragment shining on the ground, picked it up, and asked, what kind of sword is this? Even for a cheap knockoff, the quality is simply 0. Clearly, this is Elheim's doing, right? What a disappointment. When Aster ran to the base, he asked Bigger if he was okay. At that moment, Gurion announced that he had arrived earlier than expected, cousin. Judging by his appearance, Nolan couldn't even detain him, could he? He was sitting on the fortress and laughing at him, saying that he alone would be enough. He said it with such confidence that he was even starting to hope so. How are things in his area? They just captured the 3rd base. At this point, one could say they have established complete control. Aster called him by name and asked what he had done to his teammates. Gurion looked at him silently and, frowning, asked, what is he talking about? At that moment, Bigger approached him from behind and pointed his sword at his back, asking, no offense, okay? He'd said from the start that he wasn't going to play along with an idiot who challenged Elheim. They didn't even try to resist, as Gurion had said. And even for village monkeys, they were smart enough to figure out which side Elheim needed to side with. Aster asked, does he really think he can defeat him simply by overwhelming him with numbers? Gurion laughed and said, no, he's wrong, cousin. He's already won. The victory conditions in this siege battle are holding 2 or more territories by the end of the exam. Even if he desperately rushed to arm his flags at every base, he simply doesn't have the people to defend them. They only need to wait until he moves to another base and then raise the red flag again. As long as they hold 2 or more bases by the end, they'll win. Aster replied that he'll make sure they can't even do that by slaughtering every last one of them. At that moment, he got angry, and all the surrounding guys were scared. Gurion said he was just bluffing and grinned, saying that this sword had become useless, right? 7 wings or not, without a weapon, he was as good as wingless. Or did he want to try to fight them with everyone here? Aster hoped that was a problem. He was impressed, Gurion. At that moment, he broke Bigger's sword, who was standing behind him, and said that he had thought it through better than he expected. Gurion thought he had won and smiled, when suddenly Aster threw the destroyed sword aside and looked into Gurion's eyes. He said that he was good and he was quite impressed. Gurion had thought it through even better than he expected. But at that moment, he abruptly moved from his place to another and began fighting all the surrounding guys. He snatched one of their swords and continued the fight, causing one guy after another to fall unconscious. Gurion asked, what's going on? A moment later, Aster pointed his sword at him and said that, as he thought, showing up in front of him was a big mistake. He'd exposed himself too much and would simply lose to him. Gurion screamed that it was a curse, that he was simply a monster. And at that moment, Aster, using his powers, appeared behind Gurion. He screamed that it was impossible that he could fly so easily, and Aster said that he was drawing his sword too slowly. A moment later, his sword was shattered in 2, and Aster remembered the day he first flew. Since he was originally wingless, he truly felt that feeling of omnipotence when manipulating mana. Having wings is great, Gurion, but let him look at this wall that was once so high. Gurion was frightened and begged him to stop in a trembling voice, but Aster said that now it seemed so low. He smiled, and a moment later, a powerful explosion occurred in the fortress. When the dust cleared a little, Bigger said, well, What a fighting style he has. What happened, and what happened to those guys? He shouted to the side, and Bigger was stunned to see Aster dragging Gurion's body behind him, staring confidently ahead. Gurion was covered in cuts, bruises, and torn clothes, after which Aster slammed him headfirst into the ground. Gurion tried to say something but only managed to say that they were idiots. Why were they just standing there watching? They had to kill him quickly, Elheim ordered them. When Gurion shouted this, the boys exclaimed that it was a curse. Bigger lunged for his sword, and Aster asked if they were really that afraid of Elheim's revenge. Bigger exclaimed, "Of course they are. His family is just a third-class noble house that could be blown away by any wind. If Elheim wanted, they would be crushed like ants. For weaklings like them to survive in this world, no matter how pathetic it might seem, they had no choice but to behave submissively, so as not to anger the upper crust. For someone like him, who had everything, their struggle must be incomprehensible." Aster looked at him silently, then smiled. Bigger asked why he was laughing. He replied that his sister had once told him something similar. He couldn't understand the feelings of those who had nothing, and he had his own arguments against it. But the fact was that he was now blessed with power, and that's why there were things only he could do. He pointed his sword at Gurion's throat, who was growling in fear, and Aster shouted that his enemy was Elheim. If they couldn't do anything about it, then he would change everything. This current arrogant, despotic Elheim, he would destroy him. When he shouted this, all the servants looked at each other in shock and exclaimed in fear. "What?" Gurion asked in a trembling voice. "What was he saying?" Bigger also asked. "Did he even understand what he was saying?" Aster replied, "Yes, this is a declaration of war. No matter how much they cherish the current Elheim, at the end of this devotion, only betrayal and a miserable end await them. If they don't want that, they must fight. Those 7 wings he carries on his back were surely given to him for this very purpose. So let them choose which Elheim they will follow, him or Gurion." The boys were dumbfounded by what they heard and didn't know what to say, when Gurion suddenly exclaimed, "Don't fool them. This simply cannot be allowed." He had memorized all their faces and names, and if they tried to betray him, they knew perfectly well what would happen to them. Bigger lowered his gaze and, terrified, began to cry, screaming that it was a curse. He threw his sword aside and ran toward Aster, asking, he really intended to overthrow him for them? If he gave them hope, then in the end nothing would change. He would hate him. Did he hear? Aster confidently replied that he promised to do so, and Bigger stopped crying, and clutching the blue flag, began shouting, "The eldest son of the Smythe family, Bigger Smythe, he's on Aster Elheim's side." The surrounding men couldn't believe their eyes. He really said that. But that meant Gurion's plan had failed, and Gurion, getting angry, said that he was just a country bumpkin and also lay under the yoke of death. Bigger began shouting at the other men. Why are they all just watching? Now was their chance to show those upstarts from Elheim what they were capable of. He proposed betting everything on 7 wings. The men began exchanging glances, and Aster realized, -1. At least now he wouldn't have to plant flags alone, but it still wasn't enough. He needed more allies if he was going to overthrow Elheim. Gurion sat there in a terrible state, and at that moment, a subordinate ran up to him and started asking, "Is he okay?" He screamed at this worthless trash to leave him alone, angry that Aster was planning to overthrow Elheim. If he let him do whatever he wanted, he wouldn't be able to look the main family in the eye, because he wasn't like his brother. He couldn't let it end here. At that moment, Nolan approached them and asked, "What's wrong, Elheim?" For someone he hadn't seen in a long time, he looked pretty pathetic. Gurion was overjoyed when he saw him and started yelling. What had he been doing all this time? Dealing with him was his job. He smiled and realized it was perfect because he was still on his side. His crest might not compare to the 7 wings, but when it came to swordplay, he was definitely stronger than everyone else. Gurion started screaming to tear him to shreds, and at that moment, Nolan threw a red flag at him and said he came to take it back, as he figured his methods were against his code of honor. In other words, he was breaking their alliance. Gurion started screaming in anger. What? One of the guys said, "They're kidding me? Even Nolan's family is betraying them?" Another guy said he didn't even know whose side to be on anymore. Nolan said it looked like they were back to square one. Aster didn't think he'd pass this test without getting even with him, did he? Aster turned around and didn't answer, causing Nolan to say it was his family's proud swordsmanship versus his family of wings. At that moment, he brandished his sword and proposed that they finally find out who was stronger. When he lunged at Aster, he said, "No, that would have to wait." He immediately shrugged off the attack, and Nolan realized this guy was completely different, not like before. Aster shattered his sword into tiny pieces, and Nolan asked, "Is he forgetting something? Only one team can pass this exam, and if they both want to become royal knights, they have no choice but to decide here and now." Aster replied that it would be a problem for him, but he wanted him to become a royal knight too. Nolan asked again, "What?" Aster replied that he had incited everyone to overthrow Elheim, so it would be rude of him to ask him to give up his dream just because they were on different teams, right? He had a plan to make sure everyone passed. At that moment, he smiled, and Nolan tensed. Gurion frowned, waiting for the next turn of events, when Bigger suddenly asked, "That's it?" That was simply impossible. Aster replied that he couldn't guarantee it, but he was confident of success. But for everything to work out, he needed everyone's help. So first, he approached Gurion, and offered to make peace. When he offered him his hand, a moment later, all the flags were tied together, and the leader started shouting, "What's all this mean? What, they don't even know how to raise a flag?" Astor replied that the victory conditions were capturing 2 or more camps, but since they hadn't been told that only one team could raise their flag at a camp, they decided to form an alliance between their 3 teams and jointly occupy all the camps. The moderator approached him and asked, "So he wants to let them all in? Was he trying to mock the examiners?" Bigger replied that he knew it wouldn't work, and Gurion replied, "Of course not. Such twisted logic would never work." The moderator began shouting that if he were ordered to attack and destroy enemy territory, he would simply shake the enemy's hand in return. Astor replied that if the enemy was more valuable alive than dead, then yes, and the moderator pointed out that a knight is the sword of the state. It was not his place to make such judgments. Astor asked, "So he's going to disqualify them then? Since they hadn't broken a single rule, wouldn't such a decision be an expression of his ego, beyond the examiner's authority?" The examiner didn't know how to react and whispered, "Besides, if everything failed like this, I wonder if the main family would keep quiet about it." The presenter grew angry and fell silent, and a moment later, Bigger sat down across from Astor and said his great examiner had gone to consult with his superiors and they'd been sitting on hold for an hour. "They'll really be fine, right? Just don't let them say they'll all actually fail." Astor replied that he didn't know that, but at least they'd shown them it was worth discussing. Gurion sat disgruntled at the table and said nothing. Bigger was still surprised that this rich man had agreed to cooperate. What exactly had he told him? Astor smiled and replied, "Nothing special really." At that moment, the presenter burst into the room and shouted, "Attention! Director Mimir is about to announce the exam results. They must listen carefully." Bigger pestered him and asked, "Is that a director?" But he looked like an ordinary old man. Astor asked him to show a modicum of respect, and the director turned to Astor and realized it must be him. Thanks to him, they were faced with a truly difficult choice. Accepting so many candidates at once was unprecedented. There were proposals for re-examinations, but with the support of the other directors, they decided to accept his request. Astor asked what that meant. Mimir replied that everyone had passed, and at that moment, the boys were overjoyed at this opportunity. Let them continue to work hard and prove to them that their decision was not a mistake. Mimir congratulated everyone on their acceptance. Welcome to the Night Academy. When night fell, Bigger rejoiced, saying that this was simply incredible. He bathed in the bathtub, saying that the food was delicious, and the bathhouse was simply enormous. And all this thanks to Astor. Astor was next to him, but he didn't show his joy. The surrounding boys shouted that they couldn't believe he'd actually helped them all pass. "They will follow him for the rest of their lives, boss." Nolan said that a bunch of opportunists, even though just recently they were Gurion's lackeys, he wasn't going to thank him for this, okay? Bigger asked again. What did he say? Those were strong words for someone who had lost to Astor. Nolan replied that he hadn't lost. He'd simply agreed to a draw. Astor said it didn't matter, that he hadn't been challenged by Elheim, and yet they were the official candidates here. Eventually, all these small victories would turn into a huge wave that would crush Elheim. This is where their rebellion begins. His 2 older sisters had already graduated, but Alphen was still here. Since she'd entered a year early, she should know how things work here and would surely be on his side. Their training at the Night Academy began tomorrow. First, he needed to get used to life here. When he left the bathhouse, he noticed the guys looking at him from behind. Astor started shouting, "What are they doing?" They were shouting that he was a living, 7-winged man, an excellent talisman for good luck. Who knows, maybe they'd receive a divine blessing if they prayed to him. They asked God to hear their prayers, and Astor started shouting that such things couldn't happen. Meanwhile, Nolan sighed heavily in the bathhouse and said he was already dreading the future. When night fell, Helen Elheim told her that he had disappointed her, Gurion. Instead of dragging this child with 7 wings to the bottom, he had completely failed and crawled back. And she heard that he even allowed him to declare that he intended to crush Elheim. Did he mean to say that he simply stood by and watched after such an insult? Gurion fell at her feet and screamed to forgive him for this mistake, mother. He will definitely make it up to her. Next time, he will live up to her expectations. But at that moment, Lillian Elheim kicked him right in the face, drawing blood. She screamed that there would be no next time. He was a piece of trash. A worthless brat like him. It would be better to turn him into mincemeat and feed him to a magical beast. He was as worthless a loser as Dallas. Gurion begged her to please spare him. After all, she was his sister. But she continued to beat him. Gurion thought about how this curse was all his fault. It was all because of that jerk. He'd offered to cooperate and said it would be worse for him if he returned empty-handed. Gurion asked what he was even talking about. Astor replied that if word reached the great head of the main family that he'd been outsmarted by some trash from a side family and failed the exam, he'd definitely kill him. Did he understand that? Gurion gasped in fear and realized what he'd seen in his last moment. Dallas. And it was a terrifying sight. A man shouldn't die like that. He didn't want to end up like him, right? All he had to do was keep quiet and turn a blind eye to what he was about to do. At that moment, Julius told him to leave him alone. That was enough. Her sweet little brother was crying and apologizing, wasn't he? Gurion begged his brother to help him, saying they were a family, bound by blood. A family should get along. Is that right, Alphen? She was held hostage, sitting in an iron muzzle on his lap. He grabbed her head, and Alfina couldn't respond. Helen said that Elheim's image of absolute dominance, which had held the knights in check until now, was beginning to waver with the arrival of the owner of 7 wings. That's why the two of them must remind them that they weren't just here for show. Julius was delighted and smiled, because his mother had asked him to show them what true violence was. After some time, the knights gathered near the fortress, and the commander shouted that they had all been chosen as cadets for the glorious Royal Knights. However, Royal Knights are those who, in combat and strategy in any other field, are an elite troop superior to other knights. Of course, those who wish to join must also be special. Bigger screamed and tried to fight, but his sword snapped abruptly, and he cursed. The commander continued shouting that this was their cadet academy for 6 ranks. They assign a curriculum based on their abilities. In other words, the more capable a person is, the more opportunities he will have to learn advanced techniques. If a person only knows how to swing a sword, they're third-rate. Gurion couldn't help but get angry about it. If he wields magic, he's second-rate. It was similar to Nolan using magical powers. Only by mastering both swords and magic can one become a first-rate master. They have nothing to teach ordinary fools who are worse than third-rate. If they want to learn the best techniques, they must become stronger. They must constantly prove their strength. This is the only freedom granted to them. When the guys saw a bright flash of light, they retreated in horror. Aster easily completed the task perfectly. The commander then suggested they try to reach this level first. The guys were angry because they would never be able to do that, and Aster remained silent. One of the director's colleagues asked, "Is this the legendary 7 wings? What an incredible talent. He can handle the magical pillar of quality so easily. He is undoubtedly special, but the hidden potential of the 7 wings goes far beyond this, and if he's satisfied with who he is now, he'll end up being devoured. Dragons lurking in this academy." So they finally passed the exam, and they're still being tested. Royal Knights are a solid meritocracy, aren't they? Of all their first years, the only ones who don't start as 6th-rank students are him and Nolan. They're already behind, but he knew it would be like this. They say he won't become a Royal Knight until he reaches 2nd rank or higher. Aster said they'll be in trouble if they don't catch up. Bigger got upset and said he was a strict boss, and Aster asked again. What? Bigger asked again, but don't tell him he's forgotten about it? He himself said he would crush Elheim, right? Back then, there were quite a few guys who took his words seriously and think he might be able to change their situation. So let them follow him, boss. He suggests they crush Elheim together. Bigger grabbed Aster by the neck and was delighted when Aster replied that he would have to become even stronger to protect everyone. He thought Bigger was right. Elheim needed to be crushed, and to do that, he needed to become even stronger. Bigger clutched his stomach and said that they needed to eat first. If they were so hungry, they wouldn't survive the day's training. At that moment, Bigger wondered what was going on and why everyone was standing here in a crowd. Are they all busy or something? The guys replied that he was here, that it was Aster. It was terrible what was going on here. When they went inside, Julius, who was eating his sandwich, asked if he was Aster. He'd taken so long to get here that they started eating without him. Julius called him brother, and Bigger asked again, but he shouldn't tell him that this freak was the same one. Aster replied, yes, Julia Elheim, the 2nd son of the main family, 2nd in line of succession, and next to him was his younger sister, Lillian. They were siblings known as the cruelest in Elheim, so he'd clearly forgotten they were here. Lillian asked, "He has a rather cute face, doesn't he?" He was nothing like that slow, ugly, and stupid brother lying beneath their feet in the mask. Gurion was frightened and couldn't answer, and Bigger asked what that tasteless mask was. Aster replied that it was an iron shackle. It was a disciplinary device Elheim used to correct losers. Julius replied that he knew a lot for someone who grew up in a soft branch house. This guy bears the Elheim family name, and yet he was placed in the 6th rank during today's selection. It's a pathetic story, isn't it? So he gave him a gift from his kind older brother to help him try harder. At that moment, he pressed the mask even harder to Gurion's face and said that if you make food, water, and light and air a reward, then anyone will try their best as if their life depended on it. Because if they don't take off the shackles, they'll just die. Bigger was scared and didn't understand what the hell was going on here. They all had that mask on their faces. Julius said they all had sharp looks like hungry animals, right? These are their senior comrades, so let them greet them as they please. He turned to Alphen and said, "Come on. Let her not be ashamed and show them her face." Alphen came out to everyone, and he asked, "Haven't seen her in a while?" Aster was dumbfounded when he realized it was her, and thought that it simply couldn't be. He became very angry, and Julius asked, "How does he like it? His sister looks like a completely different person, doesn't she?" She was embarrassed to look him in the eye, and Aster started screaming, "Alphen's sister." She turned away from him, and Aster became very angry when suddenly he drew his sword and screamed that Julius was just a freak. What had he done to his sister? A moment later, the mask fell from her face, and Julius told him to relax. He'd made sure to prepare enough for them all. He suggested throwing a fun welcome party. At that moment, he started yelling at them to hurry up and recruit new recruits. You bastards. This is their junior iron shackle. If they want to eat properly tonight, they need to put masks on them and bring everything here. His subordinates rushed to attack Aster, and Bigger tried to confront one of them and exclaimed, "Damn, these upperclassmen, their eyes are completely glazed over." He confirmed that they were not bad. At the very least, they should all be at least rank 4. Bigger had certainly planned to fight Elheim someday, but he never thought they would attack him out of nowhere. Honestly, the difference in strength between them right now is too great. He started shouting, "What should they do, boss? At this rate, they'll become part of this masked crowd themselves." At that moment, Aster watched the guys fight and looked ahead confidently. Bigger was scared, because this guy also had a furious aura, and Aster said, "Cousin Julius, what exactly is he trying to do now?" He told him not to be so tense. "Cousin, this is just his gesture of goodwill. Does he understand? A bunch of talentless people without a single worthwhile skill are simply riding on his back to pass the exam, and they imagine themselves great cadets or something. When they're worthless, even those at the top look down on them. While he's in charge here, he can't allow such sloppiness, so he took it upon himself to take care of them, Elheim style." Aster replied that he wasn't asking about that, and Julius didn't understand his question. He said to quickly get that abomination out of his sister's mouth. That's what he meant. With these words, he rushed at Julius and tried to attack him. Alphen ran out in front of him and struck him with her sword, and he asked what she was doing. Alphen looked him in the eye, and Julius told him not to hold it against her. His sister was here with him entirely of her own free will. Did he understand? If he thinks he's lying, let him ask her himself. Right, Alphen? Lillian chuckled at him for being so mean, and Julius and Aster realized it had been a while since he last heard from her. Mom was worried because there had been no news from her for a long time, but he couldn't imagine something like this happening to her. At that moment, he rushed to her and said that he didn't know what had happened, but she no longer had to do what these people said. He would save her right now. At that moment, she threw him aside, and Aster exclaimed, "Sister?" Other guys under Nolan's command rushed towards him, shouting that if he wasn't going to finish him off, he would do it himself. He had even less nobility than his younger brother. He's sickened by the thought of someone like him calling himself a knight. Now let him raise his sword, Elheim. It's Nolan's family style. He'll burn it into his flesh. At that moment, Julius caught his sword and asked if a guy who simply swung less than a little harder than the others should really be considered a great knight. Nolan was very surprised that Julius had caught his sword, and he said he was mistaken. He felt the magic was quite hot, and Julius shouted that he was the strongest and the greatest. At that moment, he kicked Nolan aside, and Bigger rushed to him, asking if he was okay. He was burned by the magic, screaming and groaning in pain. Bigger screamed that it was a terrible burn, and Lilia said that she actually likes guys like him, the ones who put on an air of importance. It makes her want to trample his pride and dignity, so she'll make an exception and keep him as a pet, although she doesn't need that bearded guy next to him. Julia replied that being weak really is a sin, isn't it? Talking nonsense is the privilege of the strong. He also used his position to gather allies, right? At that moment, some of the guys attacked and screamed for help, but Julius continued to say that in the end, he would simply be consumed by someone stronger. So what direction does his future lead? Is he right, cousin? At that moment, Aster became very angry and swung his sword, shouting, "Julius." He tried to strike him, but Julius looked him in the eyes. Aster was shocked by his strength, and at that moment, Julius grabbed him by the neck and ignited him. Aster screamed in terrible pain and horror, and Bigger, who turned around and saw what had happened, cried out his name. Julius asked, "Is this all the power of the 7 wings can do? If so, what a disappointment. He thought it would be much more useful." Aster said in a trembling voice that he had just managed to reflect his attack just once, but he shouldn't flatter himself too much. At that moment, Aster created a bright vortex around himself, and Julius was surprised. Is it spinning? What is this guy doing? This simply can't be. Was he using his own magic? Julius tried to try, but a moment later, Aster hit him with such force that he was sent flying. Aster, sitting up, said that he was molding something there, but Julius wasn't really listening. Would he repeat what he told him again? Although you should keep your mouth shut with such trash, right, cousin? When Aster spoke, he looked him in the eyes. Bigger said that it was simply unbelievable. This freak actually did it. Aster said no, and Julius stood up and said it hurt like hell, and he sent him flying. What would he do if he scratched his precious wing crest? Bigger was surprised. It seemed like he was completely fine, and he was scared by this. Lillian grinned and said, "Brother, is he so pathetic? Mocking him like that just to get beaten?" Julius told her not to be so cruel. He had feelings too. Did she know? At that moment, he grabbed his sword and screamed, "How dare he call him trash, Aster?" He had played along with his little performance, but now he had completely lost his fear. He hoped he was ready to die. So what? Aster said they could get straight to the point. Let him just attack. When Julius swung, Aster was fully prepared to take the blow, but suddenly Julius stopped when Maze said no. They had both had enough. He grinned and commented on how much of a ruckus they had made. What do they think the cafeteria is even for? If they're going to be so rowdy, then as the director, he has no choice but to interfere. Julius told him to back off. He felt sorry for his lackey, but Maze waved his hand and said, "Young master, don't talk like that. It's better for a first-ranked student, and a candidate at that, to use all his strength against a weak opponent. And that wouldn't be good for his reputation. So please let him put the sword away." Maze walked closer and pushed the sword away from Julius, who sighed in anger and said that it had ruined the whole mood. "Fine. Let them all consider themselves lucky." Julius yelled for his men to leave. The welcome party was over. Aster yelled, "Stop." He hadn't finished talking to him yet, but at that moment, Maze touched his shoulder and told him to stop. He needed him to do him a favor, Aster. At that moment, Alphen followed Julius, and Aster shouted her name after her, but she turned around, frowned, and immediately turned away from him. Aster looked at the muzzle and thought sadly about Alphen. After a while, Bigger also appeared in the office and sat down at the table, muttering that it was a curse. Julius was a dangerous freak. Nolan was incapacitated, and several of their friends were taken away with these strange masks on their faces. What should they do now? "Boss?" Aster replied that they should have stopped him. Count Maze. The girl standing next to him began shouting that it was disrespectful to the Count, who had intervened to help. Maze asked them to stop, because everything was fine, and they were old friends. "Is that right, Aster?" The protagonist reflected on how 4 years ago, when he was summoned to the main house, this man was the only knight of a nobleman under the banner of Elheim who sided with him. He saved him then, but frankly, he still doesn't know if he's his enemy or not. They wondered what he was planning now. At that moment, Bigger asked, "He's the director, right? Even if they were from Elheim, would he really allow such tyranny to continue?" Maze laughed and said that, just so he knew, he was also part of Elheim's management, and as long as there were no serious reasons, he wouldn't question the actions of the head of the family. Aster showed him the iron muzzle and asked, "He means forcibly wearing masks to control people is not a serious reason?" He replied that they had always been a knight academy based on the principles of meritocracy, and no matter the means, if it led to the growth of candidates, there was no reason to object. Moreover, candidates under Julius's leadership rise in rank very quickly. The director also approved of this. Aster replied that it seemed he had no one to count on and turned away in displeasure. Maze asked, "He's not planning to go rescue his friends alone, is he?" "He just wouldn't advise it. The main house watches his every move, and if he challenges them out of emotion, they can expel him at any moment." Aster replied that this was no reason to abandon them, and it wasn't about feelings of justice. It's just that these things rot the human heart. They deprive a person of freedom, speech, and dignity until even the will to resist disappears, turning people into obedient and convenient tools. That's the horror of these shackles. Maze replied that he spoke as if he'd seen it with his own eyes, and Aster said he simply knew those who decided to act too late. He didn't want this to happen to his friends, and Maze wondered if it was him. But before he could finish the thought, he suddenly replied that it wasn't worth worrying about. He didn't particularly want to be suddenly expelled either, and if they could settle this peacefully, then so much the better. Maze was surprised and asked again, "So he has a plan?" The protagonist asked mockingly, "He knows how he fights, doesn't he?" 3 days later, they were training hard on the field. Bigger was running as hard as he could, muttering, "Nolan, is he sure it's worth training with his injuries?" Nolan was sure there was no time to rest. The 4th tier course was starting soon. Besides, it wasn't a wound, just a scratch. Bigger called him stubborn and said that with such mana, the one who should be worried about it was Aster. Why did he do that? He put those iron shackles on everyone and remembered how his enemy had said he had the guts to show his face again, brother. He still hadn't forgiven him for last time. And now he comes here and talks about a deal? Who the hell does he think he is? Julius was dead serious, and Aster replied that he was here to pick up his sister and classmates, whom he was holding hostage. He raised his hand and said that in exchange, he would place an iron muzzle on him. Those were his conditions. When Alphen heard this, she was dumbfounded, wondering what he was even thinking. Aster replied that he was sure he'd already heard rumors that he was suspected of treason. Putting a collar on a rebel wasn't the worst option for him. Lillian asked again, was he crazy? Did he really want to become someone's pet? Was he some kind of masochist? Julius replied that he was wrong, a thorn in Elheim's side. His mother and the council would be delighted with this decision, but he didn't seem like the type to be a good boy. So what was the catch? Aster replied that there wasn't, and Julius thought about it. Aster continued saying that the muzzle was sealed with magic, and he had so many keys he could kill him whenever he wanted, and even then, he wasn't sure he could break it. Julius got angry and realized this jerk was doing this on purpose. He responded, "Okay, he agrees, After all the loud talk, simply exchanging would be too easy. He grabbed the bottle and began melting it, muttering, 7 days, no, 10 days in this thing, no food, no water, and if he's still breathing at the end of that time, he'll release them all. Alphen was terrified, knowing it was simply impossible. He'd die. Astor immediately replied that they had an agreement in that case. The iron muzzle corrodes a person from the inside. He knew this perfectly well, and after all, he'd been raised by the Elheim tool. The Alphen he remembered had been playful and stubborn, vulnerable like everyone else. But she'd never shown weakness to anyone. She was his strong older sister. But now she couldn't even fight back with such a worthless creature and simply looked at him, weak and helpless. He silently told her not to worry, because he would break these chains for her. Then they could talk things over properly. A moment later, the guys were very tired, and Astor shouted, why were they having fun? Did anyone say they could even rest? Gurion was also muzzled and was exhausted, trying to catch his breath. He didn't understand why he was being punished for all this. Bigger kept saying that this beast didn't give any slack, even to those in muzzles. They would die before Astor could save them. For some of them, he would call it karma, but Gurion didn't respond. Bigger said he was a fool. Several days had passed and he still looked fine. Did 7 wings really have inhuman endurance? Nolan wondered how people could survive without food and water for 3 or 4 days, a week at most, and only if they didn't expend energy. With such a workload, day after day, he should be at his limit, and yet he was holding up. Nolan asked Bigger if he'd heard that story. Before the children and their family were found, the infant was said to have climbed alone through a snow-covered mountain. He trudged through snowdrifts for several kilometers. If this is true, doesn't it sound like an amazing will to live? Bigger was surprised and said that he personally still thinks it's just a fairy tale. A moment later, Lillian entered the dark room and said, here's his feeding, just like a rat. She pointed at the boy's bowed head and placed a piece of cheese on his plate. When the boy saw this, he was horrified and said in a trembling voice that he couldn't go on like this. They couldn't last much longer. Gurion began to beg his sister to just give him a hearty meal when she suddenly stepped on his plate with her foot and said that if he didn't want the cheese, he could always say so, but he couldn't throw food away. You know, unlike them, there were those who were suffering much more. It was Astor, who hadn't eaten at all and was sitting to the side. Her little brother is simply wonderful, isn't he? Isn't it time to cheer him up, Alphen? Julia sat right next to her and said she couldn't even look at him, since it was her fault he was like this. He laughed loudly, and Alphen became angry, not understanding what to do at that moment. She removed the muzzle and began to eat, and Julius didn't understand, but what was really going on? He thought he had some trick to remove the muzzle, but he didn't even try to resist. Was he really going to endure the full 10 days? It would be better for him, because they would see how long his pride lasted. But for now, he simply enjoyed the spectacle. If a sword covered in magic becomes stronger quickly, if it is wrapped in a body, then it turns into armor that protects a person's life. In other words, magic can change its role depending on the will of people. Sometimes it becomes legs faster than any steed, sometimes eyes that notice the enemy before anyone else. The enemy thought this Astor was a fool in the palm of his hand, but it was not so. The boys pounced on him from behind, thinking he was caught. But magic, an ace in the hole, can turn the tide of battle in an instant. When Astor parried the attack, the boys were utterly surprised and couldn't understand where the wind was coming from or where Astor had gone. Astor leaped into the air, and a moment later, an explosion erupted in the forest. The boys began to fall to the ground with a roar so loud that even birds took flight. The teacher explained that in the 4th tier program, they would learn more advanced, specialized magic control. Swords were forbidden during training, and those with the crest of wings possessed the ability to kill without even drawing a blade. This is precisely what they were supposed to learn in his course. Astor looked at his hands and reflected that a week had passed since he'd begun his life in a muzzle, and several days since the start of 4th tier classes. He'd already gotten the hang of combat magic training. Only 3 days remained until the end of the agreement. If he survives this, then his sister and the other students will be freed. But simply sitting around waiting is not an option. Julius has overwhelming strength even without a sword, and he still hasn't seen his maximum. It's no wonder he's a 1st tier, and he can't remain at his current level. Even now, when he's completely exhausted, he needs to find something that will close the gap between them. When he stood up, his vision began to double, and he realized his body was weaker. He collapsed to the ground, everything around him spinning, and Nolan approached him and asked if he had already reached his limit. He touched his face and realized he was feverish. It wasn't surprising. After all, he was just human. Astor was surprised when Nolan approached him and told him that Maze had said it would be a problem for him if he died. He asked him to do it just in case. He certainly has strange methods. Astor was surprised. Maze, why is he doing this? At that moment, Nolan asked him to wait a bit, because he'd been spotted and would start with him, along with that muzzle. Astor grabbed his leg with a trembling hand, and Nolan didn't understand what he was doing. He was going to die like that, that idiot. Astor wondered if he was going to save his sister now, even if he was his father. He shouldn't poke his nose into things that weren't his business. Nolan didn't understand a single word he said, but he could figure it out. He wanted to keep his word to those bastards, but he shouldn't expect them to play fair like he did. At that moment, Lillian approached them with her entire team and said that Astor looked very bad. If he wandered around looking like that at this late hour, they might take him down, demote him, and kill him. When Astor saw her, he didn't respond, and Nolan asked why she'd brought a crowd of scowling faces. This was a rank 4 training session. A high-ranking person like her had no business here. She replied that these brats said they wanted to show off in front of her, so she decided to drop in on them. He should think of it as an open lesson. The instructor said he didn't mind, but she really wanted to see the moment when Astor would fall to his knees in tears and beg for mercy. So let them ignore her and kill each other as much as they wanted. At that moment, the guys started fighting, and he wondered what they meant by their plan to break him before the 10 days were up. He'd expected some kind of nastiness, but not so openly. Now he dragged Nolan into it. Nolan decided to take care of him and tried to protect him, explaining that this idiotic night limitation prevented him from being noticed. It turned out there were many more of them. If they continued trading blows, they'd simply run out of steam quickly. He needed a cheap trump card, something that would get him out of this situation, and if he didn't come up with it, he'd lost. Lillian thought that without swords they could only beat each other. But right now, even that was painful for him, wasn't it? He was always trying to act tough, clinging to his pride, and that was the result. The longer he planned to refuse to give in, the less likely he was to win. Nolan shouted at him to dodge, but at that moment, a monster actually attacked him, and Astor, turning around, didn't have time to do anything and fell to the ground. Blood poured from his mouth, and he broke a tree with his back when he fell. He didn't have the strength to get up, and Nolan cursed, "Is he dead?" Lillian told him not to kill him yet. Later, he would become her pet. Let them beat him, but let him live. At that moment, Astor became frightened and realized he'd imagined it all. Bright, magical sparks appeared around him, and Lillian didn't understand what was happening. He had done the impossible and realized he could win. Blood splashed around the attacker's hand, and the boy realized he'd been wounded. When he touched him in that world, magical power seemed to pass through his hand. Astor rose from his seat, and the boy realized it was some kind of magical defense, albeit a very thin one. If this was all he could do, he would simply crush him again. When the boy lunged at Astor, he cried out loudly, and the protagonist pulled out his hand to parry the attack again. When he managed to do so and injured the man from head to toe, he fell to the ground in incredible pain. Lillian grimaced in surprise and thought that this simply couldn't be true. Even though he was only a rank 4, he was already capable of using attribute modification. This was a completely different level from the basic enhancement of weapons or oneself, a subtype of magical energy manipulation that gives it individual properties. While his brother's magic possessed the fire attribute, incinerating everything it touched, his magical power possessed the slash attribute, shredding everything in its path. When he realized this, he immediately began using this magic. Even magicians of the 2nd tier and above will never be able to master it unless they have an innate sense. And given that this technique is of the highest level, there is no doubt the current him is capable of killing people with magical power alone. Nolan was surprised. He still intended to be one step ahead of him. 7 wings? A chopped dumb girl climbed down from the tree to him and said that it was not bad. Frankly, she did not think he would go so far. But even though it looks impressive, he hasn't killed a single person, right? This will not stop our soldiers. Does he understand? She stepped on one of the soldiers who was groaning in pain and pulled out his sword, muttering, "But already, let them get up quickly. Useless scum." When she began shouting at them, the guys trembled, and Nolan didn't understand why she called them scum. At that moment, their iron masks were shattered and fell to the ground, which frightened Lillian. The mask fell off their faces, and no one understood why. Thank God they could breathe now. Nolan realized Astor was an idiot. He'd just done something like that. Lillian asked, "So what?" As soon as they ate, these guys became so obedient that they put their masks back on themselves. They knew their place perfectly well, and didn't even know if he'd tried to be a hero, but it was all in vain. At that moment, Lillian tensed up even more and started screaming. What are they doing? She'd ordered that jerk to be beaten. The guys stood silently, exchanging glances, and she couldn't understand what the hell was going on. Nolan decided to speak up, grinning and saying that it seemed like even after the iron shackles were removed, their souls hadn't completely rotted since they were still resisting. So what will she do? Go against him now? Lillian got angry, and Astor silently looked at Nolan, who asked, "What's wrong?" He left silently, saying he was doing everything for him. Lillian grinned, and said that breaking his own mask with such force would be a piece of cake for him, right? Had he really diligently endured all this until the promised day? For someone trying to crush Elheim, he's rarely obedient, don't you think? But such behavior will definitely backfire on him. Does he understand? He can't act like that as a member of the Viscount house. He can't do anything that his father and the others wouldn't be proud of. And at that moment, he clutched his head, and Nolan was afraid for him when suddenly he began to fall and was caught in Alfin's arms. Aster felt that this sister, and Alfin understood that he really had always been reckless ever since childhood. Let him forgive her, even though she was his older sister, and always allowed him to save her. But now he gave her courage. She hugged him and realized she would be okay. Sometime later, Aster lay in bed and suddenly jumped up. He kept thinking about his sister and wondered if he'd dreamed it. He saw an envelope lying on the floor next to him. Aster picked it up and read the words, then crumpled the paper in his hands and realized it simply couldn't be true.